Have you ever felt exhausted after spending time with someone? Not physically, emotionally. As if something inside you was drained, even though nothing obvious happened. No argument, no clear conflict, no dramatic moment you could point to. And yet, after the conversation ends, you feel heavier than before, more tired, more responsible, more guilty, without fully understanding why. You replay the interaction in your mind, what they said, what you said, what they needed, what you gave, and slowly, a quiet question begins forming inside you. Why do I always feel responsible around this person? Why do I feel like I'm giving more than I receive? Why do I leave these conversations feeling emotionally empty? At first, you may not recognize what is happening because emotional use rarely looks obvious. It doesn't look aggressive. It doesn't look cruel. It often looks like need, like vulnerability, like someone who depends on you. And dependence can feel meaningful, important, even necessary. You may tell yourself that supporting others is part of caring, that being available is part of connection, that listening is part of love, and those beliefs feel right, healthy, empathetic. But over time, something begins shifting. You notice that support becomes expectation, availability becomes obligation, care becomes responsibility, not shared responsibility, personal responsibility, yours. You begin noticing that certain conversations follow familiar patterns. They talk, you listen, they unload emotions, you absorb them, they feel relief. You feel exhaustion, not immediate exhaustion, delayed exhaustion, the kind that appears hours later when silence returns, when your thoughts slow down, when your body begins noticing what your mind ignored. And this is where the first signs often appear, not through obvious conflict, through emotional imbalance, the kind that builds quietly until it becomes impossible to ignore. You may notice that your time begins revolving around their needs, their problems, their emotions, their struggles. Not occasionally, repeatedly. You become the person they turn to whenever something goes wrong, whenever something feels difficult, whenever something feels overwhelming. And at first, this may feel like trust, like closeness, like importance. But over time, it begins feeling like pressure, not visible pressure, emotional pressure, the kind that makes you feel responsible for maintaining their stability. You begin noticing that your own needs start feeling less important, less urgent, less necessary, not because they truly are, but because their needs always feel louder, more immediate, more demanding. Another quiet shift begins forming when your boundaries start feeling negotiable, not because you want them to be, but because saying no begins feeling uncomfortable, heavy, guilt-inducing. You hesitate before declining requests, before protecting your time, before choosing yourself, not because you lack strength, but because guilt makes refusal feel selfish. And once guilt appears, your boundaries begin weakening, not dramatically. Gradually, you begin giving more time than you intended, more attention than you expected, more emotional energy than you can afford. And this is often how emotional use begins. Not through force, through repetition, through repeated moments, where giving becomes easier than refusing, and refusing begins feeling dangerous. Not physically dangerous, emotionally dangerous. You fear disappointing them, hurting them, losing connection, creating distance, and those fears begin shaping your behavior. You begin prioritizing their comfort over your own well-being, not intentionally, automatically. And once behavior becomes automatic, patterns begin forming, patterns that slowly reshape your emotional balance. You begin noticing that after certain interactions, your energy feels lower, your patience feels thinner, your thoughts feel heavier. Not because life became harder, but because your emotional resources are being used more frequently than they are being restored. And this is where awareness begins. Not dramatic awareness, subtle recognition, the kind that appears slowly but stays once it arrives. You begin noticing that certain people leave you feeling responsible in ways others do not. You begin noticing that certain conversations leave you feeling drained, while others leave you feeling supported. And once those differences become visible, a deeper question begins forming. Not about them, about the pattern. Why does this keep happening? Why does this dynamic feel familiar? Why do I feel responsible for emotions that do not belong to me? And this is where the first signs begin to reveal themselves, not as dramatic moments, not as obvious warnings, but as repeated experiences that slowly show how emotional use begins, quietly, gradually, almost invisibly, until exhaustion becomes normal and responsibility begins feeling automatic. And once that happens, recognizing the signs becomes not only helpful, but necessary, because emotional use rarely stops on its own. It continues until awareness interrupts the pattern. And the first step toward interruption is recognition. Recognition of the signs that reveal when care has quietly turned into obligation and when connection has quietly turned into emotional dependence. And this is where the first real signs begin to appear. Not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly, through repetition. You begin noticing that giving feels expected rather than appreciated. At first, your support feels voluntary. You offer your time, your attention, your presence, because you care, because you want to help, because connection feels meaningful. And in the beginning, their gratitude feels genuine, warm, appreciative, reassuring. You feel useful, needed, important. But over time, something begins shifting. Gratitude becomes less visible, less frequent, less expressive, not completely absent, just reduced, quiet enough that you begin noticing the difference. You begin noticing that what once felt appreciated now feels assumed, expected, taken for granted. They begin reaching out more often, not occasionally, regularly, whenever something feels difficult, whenever emotions feel overwhelming, whenever life becomes uncomfortable, and gradually, you become the person they rely on, not sometimes, consistently. You begin noticing that your availability is no longer requested, it is expected. They contact you without hesitation, without checking your timing, without considering your energy, because your presence has become predictable, reliable, always accessible. And reliability can feel meaningful. At first, it can feel like trust, like closeness, like importance. But over time, reliability without boundaries turns into responsibility, not shared responsibility, personal responsibility, yours. Another pattern begins forming when conversations start revolving almost entirely around them, their problems, their struggles, their frustrations, their disappointments. You listen, you support, you respond, you comfort. And while listening, you may not notice the imbalance immediately because empathy feels natural, helping feels meaningful, supporting others feels like connection. But slowly, you begin noticing something missing. Reciprocity, moments where your experiences receive the same attention, the same curiosity, the same patience. You may attempt to share something about your own life, something that mattered to you, something that affected your emotions, and for a moment, they may listen, briefly, politely, but the conversation soon returns to them, to their situation, to their feelings, to their needs, not intentionally, not aggressively, naturally, automatically, as if your role in the interaction has already been defined: listener, supporter, emotional resource. And once roles become defined, patterns become predictable. Another sign begins appearing when your emotional energy begins feeling limited after interactions. Not always immediately, sometimes later, hours after the conversation ends, when silence returns, when your thoughts slow down, when your body begins noticing how much effort was required. You feel tired, not physically tired, emotionally tired, as if your attention was stretched longer than expected, as if your patience was used more than intended, and emotional fatigue becomes familiar, not dramatic fatigue, quiet fatigue, the kind that accumulates slowly over repeated interactions. Another meaningful shift appears when saying no begins feeling difficult, not because refusal is impossible, but because refusal feels uncomfortable, heavy, guilt-inducing. You begin rehearsing responses in your mind, thinking about how to decline politely, carefully, softly, without disappointing them, without hurting them, without creating distance. And that preparation becomes exhausting, not because refusal is wrong, but because emotional pressure makes refusal feel dangerous. You may begin accepting requests, even when your energy feels limited, even when your time feels restricted, even when your needs feel urgent, because saying yes feels safer than saying no. Safer emotionally, safer relationally, safer internally, and repeated yes responses gradually weaken your boundaries, not visibly, subtly. Another pattern begins forming when your own needs begin feeling postponed, not ignored, delayed. You tell yourself, I'll rest later, I'll focus on myself later, I'll deal with my needs later, because their needs feel more urgent, more immediate, more emotional, and urgency creates priority. Even when that priority comes at your expense, you begin noticing that your time begins revolving around their emotional needs. Not completely, but frequently enough that your routine begins shifting. Your plans adjust, your availability expands, your personal time reduces, not intentionally, gradually. And once patterns become gradual, they become difficult to recognize because nothing dramatic happened. Nothing obvious changed, just small adjustments, repeated often enough to reshape your emotional balance. Another important sign appears when appreciation becomes rare, while expectation becomes frequent, not openly stated, implied, through behavior, through repetition, through familiarity. They assume you will listen. They assume you will help. They assume you will be available, not because they demand it, because they expect it. And expectation changes how effort feels. Effort no longer feels meaningful. It begins feeling required, and required effort creates pressure, not visible pressure, emotional pressure, the kind that slowly builds until exhaustion becomes familiar. And once exhaustion becomes familiar, something inside you begins shifting, not dramatically, quietly. You begin noticing your own limits, your own fatigue, your own emotional depletion. You begin noticing that certain interactions leave you feeling empty instead of supported. And that realization becomes meaningful because emotional use rarely appears through one moment. It appears through patterns, repeated patterns, consistent patterns, predictable patterns that slowly reshape how you give, and how much you lose in the process. And once those patterns become visible, the next signs begin revealing themselves, not louder, not clearer, just deeper, more connected, more difficult to ignore. Because emotional use does not always look harmful. Sometimes it looks like closeness, like dependency, like trust, until exhaustion begins replacing connection and responsibility begins replacing balance. And this is where the deeper signs begin forming, not as individual moments, but as repeated experiences that slowly reshape how much of yourself is being given without being restored. And this is where something important begins to shift, not in their behavior, in your awareness. Because once patterns become visible, they become harder to ignore. You begin seeing interactions differently, not emotionally, observationally. You begin noticing when conversations feel one-sided, when your energy feels drained, when your presence feels expected rather than appreciated. And awareness creates distance, not physical distance, emotional distance, the kind that allows you to observe without absorbing everything immediately. You begin pausing before responding, not ignoring, not withdrawing. Pausing, even a brief pause, creates clarity. You begin asking yourself different questions, not, how can I help them again? But do I have the energy to help right now? Not, how do I fix this situation? But is this truly mine to fix? And those questions create boundaries, not loud boundaries, quiet ones, internal ones, the kind that exist inside your thinking before they appear in your behavior. Another important shift begins forming when you allow yourself to feel your own limits, not as weakness, not as failure, as information. Because limits are not signs of selfishness, they are signs of balance. You begin noticing when fatigue appears, when tension builds, when emotional effort feels too heavy. And instead of ignoring those signals, you begin respecting them. You allow yourself to rest without apology. You allow yourself to disconnect without guilt. You allow yourself to delay responses without panic. And those small decisions begin restoring something essential, your emotional reserves, not instantly, gradually. Another powerful realization begins forming when you understand that support should never erase your own needs. Healthy support feels mutual, balanced, reciprocal, not one-sided, not draining. You begin recognizing the difference between caring and overgiving, between helping and sacrificing, between presence and emotional depletion. And once that difference becomes clear, your behavior begins shifting naturally, not aggressively, not abruptly, steadily. You begin choosing when to engage, when to listen, when to step back, not out of resentment, out of awareness. Another meaningful change appears when you stop responding automatically to every request. You give yourself permission to wait, to think, to evaluate. Not every message requires immediate attention. Not every problem requires your involvement. Not every emotion requires your support. And understanding that truth creates freedom, not freedom from people, freedom from pressure, freedom to exist without constant responsibility. Another quiet shift appears when you begin recognizing that emotional balance depends on mutual effort, not individual sacrifice. Mutual effort, shared responsibility, shared care, shared emotional presence. You begin noticing relationships that feel lighter, easier, more balanced, where listening flows both ways, where support moves naturally between both people. And once you experience balance, imbalance becomes easier to recognize, not because you become critical, because you become aware. You begin noticing when conversations feel draining instead of supportive, when expectations feel heavy instead of respectful, when presence feels required instead of appreciated. And awareness changes your tolerance, not your kindness. Your tolerance for imbalance. You begin protecting your time, your energy, your emotional clarity, not selfishly, respectfully. Because protecting your energy is not rejection of others. It is protection of yourself. Another powerful realization begins forming when you understand that emotional responsibility must be shared, not transferred, not assumed, shared. Each person responsible for their own emotions, their own stability, their own regulation. Support can exist, care can exist, connection can exist, but responsibility must remain balanced. Otherwise, exhaustion replaces connection, and obligation replaces closeness. You begin recognizing that emotional use often continues only when it remains unnoticed, when patterns remain invisible, when responsibility remains unquestioned. But once awareness appears, patterns begin weakening, not immediately, gradually, because behavior begins changing, not loudly, quietly. You begin setting small limits, short pauses, delayed responses, reduced availability, not to punish, not to withdraw, to restore balance. And balance creates strength, not aggressive strength, stable strength, the kind that allows you to care without losing yourself. Another meaningful shift appears when you stop measuring your worth through how much you give. You begin recognizing that value does not depend on constant availability, not on constant support, not on constant sacrifice. Your value exists even when you rest, even when you pause, even when you say no. And that realization changes everything, because once self-worth becomes independent from giving, overgiving begins fading, not instantly, gradually, through repeated decisions that respect your limits. You begin noticing that relationships feel different when your energy is protected, clearer, calmer, more balanced. You feel less resentment, less fatigue, less emotional pressure. Not because problems disappear, because boundaries exist. And boundaries protect clarity, not distance. Clarity. You begin trusting your perception again, recognizing when something feels too heavy, too demanding, too one-sided, and trusting that recognition without dismissing it, without explaining it away, without minimizing it. And that trust rebuilds emotional stability, not loudly, quietly, steadily. And perhaps the most important change happens when you realize that caring for others should never require losing yourself. Connection should feel supportive, not draining, balanced, not exhausting, mutual, not one-sided. And once that truth becomes clear, something inside you begins settling, not dramatically, gently. You begin feeling lighter, more grounded, more aware of where your energy goes and how it returns. And when energy begins returning, clarity returns with it. You begin thinking more clearly, responding more intentionally, choosing more carefully, not out of fear, out of understanding. So if any part of this felt familiar, if you recognize moments where giving became exhausting, where support became expectation, where care became obligation, do not ignore that recognition, because awareness is the first step toward restoring balance. Not forcing change, allowing change, through understanding, through patience, through respect for your own limits. And once balance begins returning, something important happens. Care becomes meaningful again. Support becomes mutual again. Connection becomes lighter again, not because others changed, because you changed. How much of yourself you allow to be used. And when emotional balance becomes stronger than obligation, when awareness becomes stronger than guilt, when clarity becomes stronger than exhaustion, emotional use begins losing its power, because imbalance survives in silence. But balance begins with awareness.